Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to Big Questions. This week we've got Ollie, who now works full-time with the Christian Unions in Oxford, and he's going to be talking on what right does God have to judge. So I shan't faff around anymore. Over to Ollie.
Thanks very much. As Joseph said, my name's Ollie Lansdowne. Thanks so much for having me here. I work with Christian unions like the one here in Cambridge, but over in Oxford. Good, no booing. I was a bit nervous about that. I work over in Oxford with Christian unions, basically because I think that Christianity is really underrated and often misunderstood. One of the things I love about Christianity is that in the Christian faith, we really value questions and the people that ask them. So that's why I was really happy to be asked to come today. So thanks so much for coming along. The question that we've got today is, what right does God have to judge me? And that's a question I can really resonate with. Because if there's one thing that I hate, and I don't know about you, but maybe you're similar, there's one thing I hate, it's the feeling of having someone looking over my shoulder, breathing down my neck, patiently waiting for me to make a mistake that they can correct and feel smug about. I've had that too many times doing emails. Question. Is that what you think the God of the Bible is like? Someone breathing down your neck, looking over your shoulder, patiently waiting for you to make a mistake that he can then correct and feel smug about. Like if that judgmental paperclip from early versions of Microsoft Office had somehow gained omniscience and omnipotence. I'm the sort of stubborn person who will deliberately make mistakes in my texts just to annoy my grammatically minded friends, and actually also to annoy my phone's autocorrect feature, which is slightly more futile as a battle. But if there's one thing I'm stubbornly determined to prove, is that the machines are not as good at correcting mistakes as humanity are at making them. All of which is to say, if this is the way that you feel about God today, I can really sympathize with you. If you think about God as some sort of divine autocorrect that you didn't even install in the first place, and that idea irritates you, I just want to say I get it. That would be so annoying. See, if each of us was to stand before a divine judge who asked us to give an account for the way that each of us had lived, I reckon very few people in this room would say, I got it all right, never made any mistakes, 10 out of 10. Much more likely, I think, would be the response that I would instinctively give. Those mistakes, they were my mistakes to make. Those were my mistakes to make, so back off. There's a really admirable independence in the empowered humanity of the modern West, isn't there? What right does God have to judge me? But it's my contention that independent, rebellious stance, well, it's just getting harder and harder to defend today, because along with the power that modernity has given to humankind, there's also come this interconnectedness. And that interconnectedness that we experience in this world has forced us to reconcile ourselves with the truth that human beings, we're actually not quite as independent as we perhaps would have liked to believe. This lunchtime, I'd like to make a start at answering this massive question, what right does God have to judge me, by exploring what we can learn from 3 different stories. First, the rise and response to the wearing of Native American headdresses at festivals. Third, at the end, Rachel Den Hollander's victim impact statement in the court case against Larry Nassar that many of us will have watched a few years ago. And second, in the middle, slightly less heavy, Mr. Darcy's first proposal to Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. I should, at this point, just briefly note that I will be mentioning and referring to both racism and sexual abuse. If that's something that you weren't expecting, please don't feel any embarrassment about slipping out. But let's get going. Rewind your minds back to the late noughties / early 2010s. Teenies, is that what we call that? I don't know. Whichever it is. Either way, think post-financial collapse, pre-EU referendum. Hipster culture is at its peak. There are beards everywhere, foam from a flat white, perfectly striped atop upper lips throughout East London. In the background, YouTube is pumping out what will soon become known as Tropical House. The Arctic Monkeys and Mumford & Sons are shortly going to be headlining the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury, and everyone, hopefully you too, is looking forward to a chilled-out summer. If you had been at the Pyramid stage, or if you're watching at home, one thing won't have escaped your attention. The proliferation of Native American headdresses being worn as a fashion accessory, came to be known as hipster headdresses. In one sense, their popularity is kind of easy to explain, isn't it? The music channel that was doing the rounds at that point was called Majestic Casual, and they certainly fitted the aesthetic. But just because something looks good doesn't mean that it's a good idea. Speaking more personally, it was around that point that I started personally to discover and learn about the significance that headdresses have in native cultures around the Great Plains in America. In these cultures, the presentation of an eagle feather is considered to be one of the highest marks of respect that you can give someone. Such is their significance that in many cases only 2 or 3 would be awarded in a whole lifetime. But when you gather enough of those together and collect them, they can be incorporated into a headdress. So you don't need me to tell you that when these treasured pieces of culture are worn cheaply, a drug-fueled rave in Somerset, well, that's kind of offensive. Listen to Tara Husker of CICCU First Nation as she describes her friend's experience of a festival in her native Washington, D.C. She says the following: Sarah sent me a video of nearly 200 students clad in bright red and white headdresses expressing her shock and discomfort at the display. Here, in the nation's capital, an entire brigade of high school students proudly wore the embodiment of cultural appropriation. She goes on to say later in the article, the history of playing Indian in the United States is a long one, harkening back to the days when government-sponsored genocide of native peoples was the norm. Sentimental racism is difficult for many to let go of. Love of romanticized Native American cultures is far easier to accept than the harsh realities of the historic and ongoing treatment of a people that continue to exist. But frankly, at this point, she says it's getting old. At its heart, that concept that she referred to, cultural appropriation, is taking something that someone else has made, emptying it of value and the meaning that they have given it, and employing it in a self-serving way as an act of domination over the original makers, whether deliberately or out of ignorance. That's why so many organisers at this point in time have banned headdresses from festivals. Treating such a sacred object so cheaply is an affront both to the culture and the people that created it in the first place and gave it its value. Yet clearly there are nuances to be mapped here that I don't have the expertise or experience to talk about properly. But the reason I want to enter into this language of cultural appropriation is because it teaches us something so important about people and the valuable things that they make. The language of cultural appropriation reminds us that creators have rights, and creators have rights over the things that they have made. When someone makes something valuable and then it's appropriated from them, emptied of meaning and used in a dominating and self-serving way, that is not okay. Pivoting back to the question, what right does God have to judge me? Here's my first answer: the rights of a creator. See, the Bible often uses this word sin that many of you will have heard of before in various different ways. And one way of understanding what sin means is that it is kind of the ultimate act of cultural appropriation. See, in the beginning, God created a world invested with meaning and value and potential and placed humanity in it to bring out its fullness, to follow his heart by bursting and remixing it into life, to use paint to make paintings, to use language and ink to write literature, and grapes to make raisins and Sauv Blanc. But rather than follow his heart, humanity took what he had made, emptied it of its value, and appropriated it for our own benefit, dethroning the creator by appropriating his creation, emptying it of the meaning and value that he had given it and using it to serve our own interests. Continues today, sometimes deliberately, sometimes out of ignorance. But using painting and ink to ignorantly spread hate and abuse, well, that's still wrong. To borrow Husker's turn of phrase, frankly, at this point, the ignorance argument is getting old. If God made this world, only he can judge it, and only he can judge properly how we should use it. If we reject his will or ignore his will, he has every right as a creator to cast judgment on us for doing that. What right does God have to judge us? First answer, the right of a creator. That's what the Bible says. the rights of a creator whose work has been culturally appropriated. Still with me? Okay, great. Let's keep going, because there's a few more things and a few more answers to this question that I think are worth exploring. Because God doesn't just have the rights of a creator to judge. I want to argue that it's not his ability to judge is not simply tied to his historic act of creation, but actually God has a responsibility to judge, precisely because he is loving. Second answer, God has the responsibility to judge of one who loves. I'm aware that might sound super weird to put those two things together. So let me just flesh out a little bit what I mean by that using an illustration that I first heard from a speaker some of you will know called Michael Ramsden. Just whack a hand in the air if you've read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Good work, Cambridge. Proud of you. Great work. Who's watched the BBC adaptation? Okay, that's where I'm coming from. I'm not going to lie, I have not actually read the book, but I have watched the BBC adaptation so many times, and it's that I'm going to be quoting from. For those who haven't read it or engaged with it, prejudice is a big theme in it. It's literally prejudgment. So judgment is actually a really major theme in Jane Austen's masterpiece, Pride and Prejudice. The moment I want us to focus our attention on is the first time that Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth Bennet. As I said, I'm going to read from the script for the BBC adaptation because television has a wonderful way of making explicit things that are probably best left implicit. Mr. Darcy says the following when he proposes the first time to Elizabeth Bennet. "In vain I have struggled, it will not do. My feelings will not be suppressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. In declaring myself thus, I am fully aware that I will be going expressly against the wishes of my family, my friends, and, I hardly need add, my own better judgment. But it cannot be helped." To which each of us watching is rightly infuriated on behalf of Lizzie Bennet. Why? Why are we infuriated by that? I want to suggest that the reason we're infuriated by what Mr. Darcy says is because we know that genuine love exists in the presence of best judgment, not the absence of it. You can't love someone against your better judgment. That's not love, that's prejudice. To tell someone you love them, but only when you resist your better judgment, well, frankly, that's pretty offensive. Only once you know someone and have judged them properly, can you really love them genuinely? Friends, God the judge has the rights of a creator, but also he's got the responsibility to judge of one who loves. But pivoting one more time, here's the problem for each of us in this room. If the loving creator is to judge humanity rightly, here's what the Bible says his judgment will be. You are so valuable, and you are so wretched. You are so valuable, and you are so wretched. You are bruised, and you are a bully. You don't need me to tell you, the scars of hate and aggression and abuse cover the face of this earth and cover the hearts of each person in this room. Each one of us has been mistreated and in big or small ways. But if we're honest with ourselves, isn't it true as well that each of us have mistreated others in big and small ways too? Knowing the value of what he has made, when the loving creator encounters mistreatment and abuse, big or small, his love demands that justice is done. The loving response to abuse is to seek justice. There are a few people who know that as clearly as Rachel Den Hollander, the lead witness in the trial of serial child molester Larry Nassar. In her victim impact statement, testifying to the court against Larry Nassar, the man who sexually assaulted her and hundreds of others as children and young people, she framed the court proceedings in the following way. She said, "I submit to you that the preeminent question in this is the same question that I asked Judge Neff to consider. How much is a little girl worth? How much is a young woman worth?" She went on to say, "Who is going to tell these little girls that what was done to them matters, that they are seen and valued, that they are not alone and they are not unprotected? And I could not do that, but we are here now. And today, that message can be sent with a sentence you hand down. You can communicate to all these little girls and to every predator, to every little girl or young woman who is watching, how much a little girl is worth. I'm asking that when we leave this courtroom, we leave knowing that when Larry was sexually aroused and gratified by our violation, when he enjoyed our suffering and took pleasure in our abuse, that it was evil and wrong. I ask that you hand down a sentence that tells us that what was done to us matters, that we are known, we are worth everything, worth the greatest protection the law can offer, the greatest measure of justice available. That's the question that Rachel Den Hollander put to the court in the trial of Larry Nassar and asked them to answer. And if the loving creator of the Bible is also the divine judge, that is the question that he must answer when he hands out justice to this world. God, how much is a little girl worth? How much is a young woman worth? God, how valuable are the things that you made? When you look at justice in the Bible, something really quickly becomes apparent. The price that justice demands in the Bible is proportional to the dignity and value of the thing that has been mistreated. Abuse someone's property, that's bad. Abuse an animal, that's worse. Abuse a human being, and it is unspeakably abhorrent. So think about this. What does justice demand from those of us who have mistreated the infinitely valuable God of heaven and earth? It would take an eternity to answer for those crimes. Friends, the God of the Bible is not some sort of divine, dispassionate autocorrect, peering over our shoulder, waiting for us to make a mistake so that he can correct us and feel smug about it. No, the God of the Bible is the one who is 100% committed to righting wrongs because he knows his worth and the full value of everything that he has made. Which means he knows your value and the value of every person that each one of us has ever mistreated or not treated with appropriate dignity. And the truth is, every time you mistreat an employee or a friend or a refugee or a little girl, you abuse the creator who invested them with value. The judgment hanging over humanity right now is you are so precious. I made you so precious, says God, and you are so wretched. You have so mistreated the things that I gave you and the people that I placed around you. Pivoting one last time. That is the reason why Christians make such a big deal of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. That is the reason why the friend who came along with you today could talk for days about the time when God became a human being, the one treasured since before the world began, became a human being so that he could be cursed and crucified to death. As we close, let me just explain a little bit about what that means. If the Bible is to be believed, one day I am going to stand before the God of heaven and earth, and Ollie Lansdowne is going to be asked to give an account for how I have lived my life, how I used my time, how I used my money, how I treated the people around me, and how I have treated the one who made them valuable. Why I lied to the people who loved me, why I belittled the God who made me, why I treated women as objects and God as a nuisance. And after I have given account for the way that I have lived, God will be asked a question. God, how much are you and the things that you made really worth? God, how much were each of those people that Ollie mistreated really worth? And God, how worthy are you? And at that point, wretched man that I am, I would have no right except to be diminished to nothing forever. But because I have put my trust in Jesus, according to the Bible, that is not what is going to happen. Instead, God will point to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, to the crucifixion of his beloved son, Jesus Christ, the moment when Jesus willingly took my punishment for me, became wretched for me, and say that is how much a little girl is worth. the life and death of my beloved Son. That is what a human being is worth. The fullest measure of justice available. And instead of sending me to the depths of hell to pay for what I have done, he will welcome me into his home as a beloved child forever, because justice has already been done. The price has already been paid. Jesus' death means that sinners can be forgiven and justice can be done. God's judgment of humanity is you are valuable and you are wretched, you are bruised and you are a bully. The Christian message is none other than this: the eternally beloved Jesus Christ died and became wretched so that those like me, who deserve an infinite sentence of justice from God, might receive nothing but his eternal love. So that God could look at Jesus on the cross and then look at those who trusted in him and say with his very best judgment, I love you. You are my beloved child now and forever. If you accept the forgiveness that Jesus offers, if you accept the forgiveness that Jesus is offering, God will look at you and say, my justice has been satisfied. All that is left for you to experience is my extravagant love. Wrapping things up to a close, the world is a very precious thing, full of very precious people made by a very precious God. When God gave humanity and human beings the universe, he gave us a very valuable thing, and we have misused and abused it beyond imagining. Today, Cambridge, God offers you one more thing: his forgiveness won by the death of his beloved Son. Question: will you take it for what it is? Or will you exploit that too? Look, we've dealt with some really heavy topics today, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that are popping up all over the room. We're going to come to a time of Q&A in just a moment, but before we do that, I want to send us out into tables. I've got a couple of questions for you guys to discuss around your tables. Number one, what's your judgment on the human race? What's your judgment on humanity? How well do you think we've done? Number two, wherein lies your hope for justice? Where do you look for justice to be done? Number three, how would you have God treat the world? And number four, do you think justice and forgiveness can ever be reconciled? Let me run through those one more time before I send you onto your tables. What's your judgment on the human race? Number two, where is your hope for justice? Number three, how would you have God treat the world? And number four, do you think justice and forgiveness can ever be reconciled? You've got a good few minutes on your table, so take your time.
Right, thank you everyone. If you could just draw them to a close, and Ollie will hop back up and respond to your questions. Please be texting in more if you have any sort of follow-up ones, or maybe just wave your hand up in the air. So just to start with, does anyone have one from the floor that they just like to ask that they haven't texted in? And we've got a microphone. Nope. Okay, we'll start with one from me then, Ollie. You said that God isn't this sort of divine autocorrect, but yet he's the creator. But has he not created the standards that he's expecting us to live by?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, he has created the standards of what justice means. I suppose that doesn't mean that he's therefore capricious to enforce them. Just because someone defines how something should be used, it doesn't mean that it's not loving of them to enforce it. That is the way it's used. I suppose going back to what we talked about with when people groups make valuable things and then those are misused, we don't say, oh, who do you think you are telling us what your plan was? So that would be the first thing. And the second thing I would say is that it's not as though God comes up with some laws over here and his sort of loving character is sort of sitting over here, but rather that it was out of love that he brought the laws of justice into existence, and that he defined the way in which the world should be used and the way in which people should act. That's something which I can say from the front, but the only way you can really understand whether or not you think that's true is if you open up parts of the Bible which talk about what God wants for the world. So I suppose that would be the best place to go. But the place where Jesus summarizes them is where he says the whole law can be summed up in two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's like the golden rule in Christianity. So part of me wants to just say, if you think it's unfair of God to enforce rules that he made, do you think it's unfair of him to enforce that rule? Because that's what he thinks we should live like.
You sort of attributed the bad in humanity to humans itself and the good coming from God. Can we not give humans any credit and say that some goodness came from ourselves? It seems very cynical, the biblical view.
Yeah, great question. As in, it sounds like in the Bible's understanding, God is like doing some great stuff over here and human beings are basically as bad as is possible to be. Yeah, great. I'm really sorry if I gave that impression. That's not a biblical approach to what human beings are like. Rather, there's this real muddle going on in the human heart. The Bible would describe people as though everything that we do is always riddled with wrongdoing. But it's not saying that everything we do is always the worst it could possibly be. I mean, you can step outside and you can see some of the amazing things that people have achieved. First one who comes to mind, Rachel Den Hollander, the way that she stood for justice for the people who had been abused. Martin Luther King, who stood up and was subsequently assassinated for defending the rights of black people. So the first thing I would say is that the Bible's view of humanity is not you are always the most awful all the time. That's not it. It's everything we do is riddled with wrongdoing. And the reason for that comes back to what Jesus said. That what does it mean to live a good life? It means to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And it's interesting that the Bible basically treats those as one command. That if we're going to honor and respect people, we have to honor and respect the one who made those people, in whose image they were made, is the way that the Bible would put it. The people who reflect the true God. So tracing that back, yeah, I guess basically when you treat someone with dignity, there's goodness going on there. And we can just list so many examples, can't we, of times, certainly in my life, where people have treated me with loving kindness. But if we're not going all out in doing that, if we're not doing that fully, and if we're not treating the God who made those people with the same dignity, then all of our actions are riddled with wrongdoing. I'm not sure if that's really answered the question. I don't know if you or someone from the floor wants to push back on that, if that was your question, because it's a really good one. Marilyn Robinson, who many of you will know, recently did a lecture series in Cambridge, and one of the things she said, which just I think is so true, is she said the Bible doesn't have neat categories of good and evil people. Rather, all the people in the Bible are both of those things at once.
Why would God create humans who could break his law and hurt other humans?
Yeah, good question. Can you read that again?
Yeah, sorry. Why would God create humans who could break his law in the first place and hurt other people?
Yeah, that is a great question. If you ask that, thank you. I'm really, one of the reasons I love these events is because I think as Christians we should be committed to honest answers to honest questions. That's a very honest question. I'll do my best to give you an honest answer. I struggle with that. That's something I find really hard. Here's what I think the Bible has to say. The first thing I would say is that the God of the Bible is most committed to maximizing goodness rather than minimizing badness, if I can put it like that. You can see that really obviously if you open up the first page of the Bible. It says, God saw what he had made and it was good. And if you were to replace that with God saw that what he had made was not bad, you'd be like, that's a very different thing. You probably shouldn't have bothered, God. That wasn't really worth it. If God only wanted to minimize badness, he wouldn't have done anything. The reason God made the world is to display the glory of his goodness, to maximize that, first thing. Second thing, God didn't make a painting, he made a film. God didn't take a photo, he wrote a story. It starts in the beginning. So if we're going to judge what God has done, we need to judge the entire story of the Bible. So the question that the Bible would have us ask, when God created the world, and then we see bad stuff happening, and we're like, God, why the flip did you do that? That was such a bad idea. This is awful suffering. And I don't want to minimize that at all. There are some awful things happening in the world. The question that the Bible would have us ask is not, is this individual scene bad? But is God's story good? Is the whole story good? I don't want to present that as though I find that an easy thing to accept. There is a right response when we see something awful happening that says, God, where are you? And if you look at a book in the Bible called the Psalms, that's something that the writers of the Psalms say continuously. Sometimes they don't even get beyond that question. They just leave it with that. God, where were you? But the Bible would have us not just stay there, but look to where the story is going. And the Bible claims that the story of God's world is not a tragedy, not something that ends in the bad place to which it has sunk, but rather a comedy in the literature term. It's something that goes through the darkness, but comes out in the light. The night is long, but the morning comes. Jesus went down into the grave, but he burst up again. That's just the shape of the entire Bible. I've heard someone say before, the shape of the Bible is the Nike swoosh. It goes down, it always comes back up. So that's the context in which we're to judge that. Yeah, I probably wouldn't want to go much beyond that, except to say, I guess the question, if you're going to reckon with that, is do you think good things can come out of evil things? Do you think good things can come out of evil things? The Bible would say absolutely yes. Number one way we know that, because the worst thing that has ever happened when the beloved Son of the Father, the Lord Jesus Christ, in all his majesty, came a human being, he was crucified, and no greater atrocity has ever happened. But God, in his wisdom and power, decided to use that event, ordain that specific evil, to bring the most good that has ever been done by bringing humanity to himself. Yeah, feel free to push back on that, because I realise I've probably raised more questions than answered.
You just touched on what is, I'm afraid, going to have to be our final question now. Just at the end there, you were mentioning, how can one event in history be enough to make all history right? A single act sort of fixes everything. How does that work out?
Great question. Thank you for asking it. You wouldn't be able to right the world if just some random human being, if Joseph decided to take all of human sin on himself. That would not be effective for two reasons. Sorry if this is offensive, Joseph. Firstly, Joseph is not infinitely worthy in the same way as God. He cannot take on all the worth of all people ever and express that in his death. And also, Joseph and me and you have our own crimes to pay for. The reason that one act at the cross can right every wrong is because Jesus is infinitely worthy. That at the cross, someone infinitely worthy shed his blood. The eternally loved Son of God was pierced to a tree and left essentially to suffocate himself to death. There has been no one more valued, and there has been nothing more atrocious, which essentially means because Jesus had no crime to pay for himself, and because he was infinitely worthy, he could take all of the wrongdoing that had ever been done upon himself and exhaust it. He could exhaust injustice and death. When he died, all of God's wrath was expended on him, and he could still burst up from the grave because he is infinitely valuable. He is the infinitely valuable Son of God. He's not just some random guy. He's not just some random human being who died. This is the infinitely valuable God of heaven and earth, the only one who could exhaust the injustice that had been done and still burst up from the grave afterwards. Such a good question. Thanks so much for asking that. I hope I've done a little bit of justice to it. That was the last question, I think. So before I step down, firstly, thanks so much for coming. Such a joy to see some of you here. I'm going to be hanging around afterwards. If there's anything that I've said that you were annoyed by or had questions about or wanted to just tell me what you thought about, I would love to either listen or respond, depending on what you want from me. Secondly, on your tables, you will find these little books. They are called Uncover John. They're essentially an eyewitness testimony of Jesus' life. If you are going to think about God's character, that is the place to start. That is the book that has transformed people's lives throughout history, in which the Bible claims we see God made human, where we can actually finally, truly, most deeply understand what God is like. It's the full and biggest and final revelation of who God is. If you are going to, in one sense, sort of judge the God of the Bible, do it on the basis of that. I can't recommend it highly enough. Thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Do head off if you need to rush off. Just to say, yeah, as he said, grab him afterwards, carry on chatting around your tables. Feel free to stay if you can. The last couple of weeks have been quite big questions about suffering and judgment. So is the Christian faith just about trying to answer these questions where there aren't really answers? So next week we'll be looking at, is Christianity just a crutch for the weak? Just an answer for those questions we can't answer? Is it all just made up by humans? So do come back next week. Thank you.